Right, Katherine, should we start with you? Is it even polite to use the word gypsy? Because I'm not sure whether that is a recognized term that is, mainstream these days, or whether it still has sort of connotations that maybe you shouldn't even use it. How can we talk about the people that we're spending the next hour talking about?
I mean, that was something I kind of addressed in my introduction to my book, because if you look at quite a lot of the documents, especially coming from Europe, that it's not used so much anymore, and it's seen as a kind of contested word, particularly in Germany, the German equivalent. But here in England, it is still very much used, and in fact, quite a lot of units would use it. But I wasn't kind of satisfied with that, so I went and asked people from the communities what they thought about what the title of the book should be. In fact, I think I asked your mum, Damian Le Bas, who is a fantastic artist, visual artist, because she was running an exhibition at the time. It's probably about a few months before the book came out, called To Gypsyland. And I said, so is it okay to use the word gypsy? The same question that you're just asking me. And she said, in some ways, we're kind of reclaiming it as a word, a lot of artists and a lot of people who are working in the community, because we it's a word that people use about us and we use about ourselves. So I thought, okay, I think I'm comfortable with using it if I'm hearing that from the communities. So that was the reason. Are you happy with it, Damian?
Are you happy to sort of say I'm a gypsy, or for people to?
I am, yeah. When other people use these words, I try to look for the intention behind the word, really, rather than sort of obsessing over the word itself. I actually quite like the word gypsy because I think it's clearer what it means than most of the alternatives. Words like Romani is very easy to confuse with Romanian, even though etymologically they're completely separate words. And the word Roma is, aside from being the capital city of Rome, is sort of actually alien to a lot of Romani subgroups. So it's slightly complicated. I like the word gypsy. I think it's clear.
And we're talking about roughly 300,000 people in the UK, in the British Isles, who you would categorise in this term?
More a question for Damian. I mean, no one really knows, to be honest, do they?
There are lots of estimates floating around. In 2004, the Commission for Racial Equality estimated there were about 300,000 Romani gypsies. So, if you like, indigenous Romani people in the British Isles. And in 2011, only 55,000 of those people self-identified as gypsies or travellers in the census. So there's a bit of a disparity there. And also we've got a large number of recent immigrant Roma people from Eastern Europe, at least 200,000 according to Salford University.
I was struck, though, you mentioned that about a third of the people of Kent probably have Romani blood in them. And I wondered, how on earth did we get through the European elections without Nigel Farage citing that as the ultimate proof of real gloom and doom? But a third of the people of Kent, I must say, sort of perked me up. On what do you base that?
Well, I mean, that came from various academics, but it's not actually that... it's not that surprising if you think about the hopping fields and the kind of tradition in Kent and other southern counties of English gypsies, and in fact Irish travellers also working circuits and going down to the southern counties to hop and do other sorts of agricultural labour. I don't actually find that surprising, and in fact it's become somewhat fashionable, I think, for people to say they've got a granny or a great granny who comes from gypsy blood. In fact, we were talking about there's a kind of sort of modish now to kind of have films and radio programs and so on that bring in gypsy and traveller characters almost. It's a kind of renaissance. We were talking about that earlier, weren't we?
Yeah, I think close enough for you to be able to mention it, but far enough away for it not to interfere with your personal life.
For you not to get moved on, evicted, denied access to housing and so forth. We'll look at some of those issues shortly, but why is it? Because you've mentioned, the capital city of Italy, Rome, connotations very positive. Romans, what have the Romans done for us? We'd be here all night. Bridges, democracy, and so forth. But nobody asked, what have the Romani done for us? And what is the answer to that? Because to what extent is the core issue here the bad press that the Romani people have had, I guess, and continue to have?
I think a lot of people are very aware of the cultural contributions that Romany people have made. Certainly people who run Spanish postcard shops have been capitalising on it for years with those weird little, flamenco ones with the fabric dresses on and stuff like that. So, it's kind of the national music and dance culture of Spain. The same goes across swathes of Eastern Europe. The klezmer orchestral culture of Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria. So there are things like that on the one hand. I think the issue perhaps is more that people don't necessarily make a connection between the richness of that culture and what they see as a problem social group, for instance, in this country. But actually, we are directly connected by ancestry, culture, language, and custom.
Some of the customs are, just looking at your thing here, there's a sort of advert ahead of the Appleby Horse Fair saying, keep your fair safe and enjoyable for everyone. Bare knuckle fighting is illegal. It will not be tolerated and will be stopped by the police. You don't get that warning when you turn up at the Hay Literature Festival. Though it is, just so you know, in case anyone gets carried away, bare knuckle fighting is illegal, so contain yourselves. But that suggests that there are parts of the culture that are, quite unattractive. Is that some of those customs ones that have survived and, you would want to disown?
Well, the first thing I'd do is point people to the historical context of bare-knuckle fighting, and it was actually a sport systematised by the Marquis of Queensberry. So in the not-too-distant past, it was an aristocratic pastime. And
doesn't make it any better.
I'm not suggesting that it does. I'm just trying to put it in its context. And Romany people and Irish travellers in terms of things like that, and the same goes for blood sports, to be fair, things like hare coursing, which were once common pastimes, and people tend to be conservative with a small c when it comes to retaining that stuff. Whether it's good or bad morally is a question for the individual, I think. None of these things are pastimes that I engage in. But they do have a past which is wider than our community, and that has to be acknowledged.
Katherine, you came to this from a deep sense of injustice that you witnessed at one particular, very newsworthy event. Take us back to Dale Farm and your involvement and what you witnessed there, because that is the starting point of your book, essentially. The helicopters overhead, the burning caravans, you paint the picture for us.
Well, I'd first gone to Dale Farm back in 2006, and that was really when the planning, the kind of long planning battle, which had actually been dragging on for a few years before that, had started to draw towards the beginning of the end, even though there wasn't much media interest at that stage, there was the sense of an end game. And in fact, it was quite hard. I was at The Economist then to get people to be that interested, but I was really glad I went. And it was interesting going there because I didn't come from a gypsy or traveller background, and even though my mum had taught traveller children, because we grew up in East Anglia, in fact, some of them now, we know children now who are now very successful playwrights who didn't go to school nearby, which is kind of a weird coincidence. But, I didn't really know people from that background, and I kind of felt this was a very misunderstood community. And I think I grew up, thinking I had some of the prejudices of the settled community, and they were swept away quite quickly by going to Dale Farm. And I was really, I felt these were people who needed neutral reporting about them, and they weren't really getting neutral reporting. And that's all you should really ask for as a community, is to be treated fairly. This is this big phrase, actually, from Gypsy community, fair play, which is actually what I originally wanted to call the book. And I kind of felt Gypsy and travellers weren't really getting fair play in reporting. Now, that is not to say that the Dale Farm residents shouldn't have been evicted, because I think, in the end, that encampment was very big, and it had grown bigger and bigger. But there were many, many reasons why it grew bigger, which were to do with the lack of smaller sites in Essex. And many of the families, the 86 families who actually ended up there, had been travelling around Essex for 10 to 12 years before then, looking for small family sites. They had not wanted to come to Dale Farm and set up that big site, which I think they didn't really want to live in, because it was very big and unwieldy, and it wasn't like your conventional traveller site, which is relatively small and family run, and was unwieldy and ultimately unacceptable, not acceptable in planning law, but also unacceptable to the settled community for various reasons. So I think it was going to come to the end of the line. So even though I feel that gypsies and travellers have been treated unjustly and continue to be treated unjustly, I feel that in the end, Dale Farm itself, you could see there was a sense of inevitability about what had to happen, but the way it was done was not good. It didn't need to be done in that way. There were people who were negotiating who could have dealt with it better, but there were many reasons for that. It was like the fates started to work. It was like watching some kind of old Greek play like Antigone, where you can kind of see everything conspiring to create a very thorny situation, and everyone plays their part in the end, and no one can get out of this.
In the end, you mentioned that it wasn't a great site. I hadn't realized till reading your book just how profoundly unsuitable it was. It was actually contaminated land, electric pylons overhead. It was an appalling place for anyone to grow up, wasn't it?
And yet it was a home where then people went to school, got qualifications, and then parents and grandparents also learnt to read and write. And you can see why families decided that if this is the only home you can have, we will fight for it. See, there's many paradoxes about Dale Farm, and this is why it's quite difficult to talk about, because those families were very strong and resilient, as many people have said. Vanessa Redgrave went there. She may even use those words. And they did become a community that was quite cohesive at that time. And they held very strongly to that because they had nowhere else to go. And if you go back to Dale Farm now, a third of those families are still living on the roadside. It tells you something about the gypsy and traveller homelessness in the UK, that they are still living there without any sanitation, without proper access to water. Many of the children have eye problems. There were problems, as you'd expect, with urinary tract infections, diarrhea, and so on. You would expect that. But somehow it's clear that we have failed. There is a institutionalized failure if people are living like that in the UK. The 7th richest country in the world, I think. You
mentioned in your book, though, that more than half the families had been offered social housing nearby.
53
out of 80 or something.
Had been offered flats, but they weren't flats where they could all live together. So for instance, take the McCarthy family, who some of you will have seen on the television. So you have a strong extended family with, I think at that stage there were 4 daughters, married daughters, and Mary Ann McCarthy, who was a widow, a grandmother, and then obviously grandchildren. Mrs. McCarthy, Mary Ann, was offered a flat on her own, so that would have wiped away her whole support structure. Now you could argue, and many people did, that, well, why is she a special case? But from her point of view, she was losing a support structure that had sustained her for many years. So you can see why she fought so hard to stay there. And interestingly, out of the 4 families that I really concentrate on in the book, the McCarthy family are the only ones who found a home. The other 3 are still homeless.
Damian, to what extent is there a tension between being offered, a solution in terms of better sanitation and heating and water and all the rest of it in social housing, and giving up the sense of support structure, way of life, the sense of community? Talk us through that tension.
I think for many people it ends up being quite a bitter choice, to be honest, between, as you mentioned, security and the comforts and assurances of a modern lifestyle, but also the sense that you've lost something infinitely more precious if you take that former option. Speaking from my own point of view, it's something I've thought about all my life, really. I've lived in all kinds of accommodation, caravans, chalets, council housing, privately rented housing, university digs, all of it. And it's almost an anomaly in the British Isles, in that gypsy and traveller people have so tenaciously clung actually to the nomadic lifestyle until recent times, and indeed into the present. If you go to parts of Eastern Europe, for instance in Romania, there are Romani people who've actually not been nomadic for 550 years, sometimes as a matter of collective choice, or individual choice, sometimes as a matter of indentured slavery where they were unable to move because of belonging to Romanian noblemen, for instance. So the situation depends on where you are. What I would say is that there's a danger here of getting bogged down in speaking about mobility as the defining characteristic of us as ethnic groups. And we are ethnic groups. If there's any such thing as ethnic groups, then we are it, in the same way that Jewish people or Arabs or French people are ethnic groups. So, for instance, we've spoken a bit about the Romani language. The Irish travellers speak their own language, which goes by several names, including Cant. There are customs around family rituals, around birth, marriage, and death. Nobody sees any of that stuff. They see the tip of the iceberg, which is the use of a caravan, but that doesn't define us ethnically any more than the use of a knife and fork.
Some of those customs, when they see them, and you've looked into this, domestic violence, they see that as a problem. They see marriage among very young people. I think the phrase in your book is that there's an acceptance of marriage at a much younger age, much younger than 16. Some of those customs, is that just bad press, or is that, and stereotyping or bigotry, or is some of that based on ongoing reality?
Can I just say, I'll just clarify, I found no evidence of forced marriage in the Gypsy traveller community. In fact, I looked into it very carefully, because I think it's a very important point to make, because one of the chief prosecutor in the Northwest actually splashed in the Independent a couple of years ago that it was a major problem in the traveller community. I did not find evidence of that. There is some evidence of arranged marriages in some communities. I think that's right, isn't there? But a lot of people choose freely. Sorry, I know that's mainly to Damian, but I just wanted to clarify that point because it maybe wasn't clear.
Well, in my extended family unit, as an example, which consists of hundreds of people, I can't think of a single example of either of forced or arranged or underage marriage at all. So that's only one subsection of one Romani subgroup, if you like. And in fact, yes, marriage at below the British age of consent does happen all over the world, including in some Eastern European Romani communities. But again, I hope you don't think this is a platitude. I think it's a very important contextualizing point, but actually, this was a Europe-wide custom until the relatively recent past that was generally linked to property rights. If you take the kind of the nobility as an example. And in many respects, Romani people have found it, let's say, challenging or impractical to move with the times in terms of terrible education, poverty, the worst infant mortality rates in Europe. So there are those problems that we have that we found difficult to leave behind. And in tandem with that come some of these issues which are socially controversial.
So just one more of that, because you referred, Katherine, to a study in Wrexham that suggested that between 61 and 81% of gypsy women had suffered abuse at the hands of their partner or husband or whatever. And you were quite disturbed by that.
But I also said it's a very small-scale study, and no one knows. That study may well be way out of whack. We don't know. And there are people in the community who are looking at domestic violence. There's a problem with domestic violence in every community. Obviously, if I write a book about the Gypsy traveller communities, I'm not going to dodge the fact that there's problems with domestic violence in the Gypsy traveller community. At the moment, I'm writing a book about the Yemeni community, which is about honour-based violence. So obviously, I'll look at it again.
80% of the sample?
The Wrexham study, people have looked at it very carefully. People think the sample was very small. But I did look at it. But for me, the key thing is the forced marriage point, where there is a theory, a scapegoating theory, where you have to tread very carefully with groups, especially in times of economic crisis, where we cherry pick tiny points and we use them to scapegoat particular groups in times of economic crisis. We can see it with disabled people at the moment. We can kind of see it with the Roma, and I would be wary of cherry picking very small-scale studies. That's one study I looked at in a whole chapter. If we just take it out of context and bradish it, it looks terrible. But if you look at it in the context of an entire 3 chapters. You know, a big bit of my book is on violence against the communities, as well as violence within the communities. No one's ever looked at the violence against the communities. It unbalances what I'm trying to say, which is that there is violence within communities, against communities, and by communities. And you have to look at all 3 to get some sense of violence. And that's very, very important. It's what I did with disability as well. And you have to do that. Otherwise, you can't really assess what's happening to a particular community of people.
Okay. So, Damian, beyond doubt, some of the issues that are a handicap for the community and where they suffer and where you want to try and address major social issues, attendance at school, educational attainment, you yourself, you know, read theology at Oxford, first-class degree, but not typical of the community. A lot of homeschooling, some of it you catalogue because of bullying of gypsy children in schools and all that, but an awful lot of social problems that are, you know, bad in general, are horrendous in that community, aren't they? And health problems and sort of and life expectancy. To what extent is that what has driven you to try and give voice to the community and start the Traveller's Times and all the other work that goes with it?
I think those problems are a definite impetus for anyone who works with our communities. I mean, some of the statistics are truly harrowing, you know. Infant mortality rates is always the one I come back to because they're kind of Victorian, really, amongst particularly nomadic gypsies and travellers. I mean, it's horrendous. But equally important for me as a sort of driving force behind this work is the desire to simply introduce a bit of nuance, a bit of basic, for want of a better word, intellectual subtlety to it, because what I still detect all the time is that actually we're working against 2 forces here. One of them is a genuine lack of information or sureness about the facts, but the other force, which is probably far more difficult to overcome, is people's sense that they already know everything about us before we've said anything. So even if, for instance, the study about domestic violence took a small sample and is questioned by other people in the field, there is a sense which is very real and important that people already know that we're all a load of wife-beating, misogynistic, tax-dodging loons. And that's what I find myself engaging with more frequently than any academic evidence, which in many cases is actually quite scanty.
And what would you like people to think? That, like every other community or ethnic group, you come in all shapes and sizes and character traits and all that?
The day everybody believes that's the case, I can hang up my boots.
Is there a tension though between addressing some of those problems, educational attainment, health and all the rest of it, and preserving the way of life that is also at the heart of this? You know, if you want to live in a certain way, are you not more likely to suffer from ill health and poverty and lack of educational sort of opportunities and lack of career opportunities?
There is obviously a tension there, isn't there, between the freedoms that people used to enjoy and the problems that they used to endure as a result of a lifestyle which has been romanticised, I think for good reason. There was a lot that was romantic about it. There was also a lot that was incredibly difficult about it, particularly in the winter, which is the bit that elderly Romany and traveller people who remember those days are sort of not so keen to talk about. Partly because it was so tough, it was the worst time to give birth to a child, there was no work, and also you were stationary, sometimes for more than 6 months of the year during the winter. So if there's one point I could sort of leave with you and hope that you sort of contemplate for a bit, it's that there's never been any such thing as perpetual motion in the gypsy and traveller communities. People always had to stick out the winter in one place, and then it was during the spring, summer and autumn months that they travelled around for work and to maintain their lifestyle. And that being the case, I at least can feel secure in the fact that when I, for instance, go to bed or if I'm stuck in a traffic jam, I don't cease to be ethnically a gypsy because I'm not in motion for that sort of 1 to 8 hour period. So if there's one kind of facetious question that I'd like to see crushed within my lifetime. It's, if they're travellers, why don't they travel?
Okay, now questions from the audience. Let's start here down in front, and then if I can have a little bit of light after that so I can see people behind. Fantastic, thank you very much.
The answers to your questions have been really truthful and honest, and I'll hold my hands up to you. It's a couple of things there. I sit on a domestic violence panel as a magistrate. It's in Peterborough. I'll say I've never had a traveller or gypsy case before me. I've had every other ethnic, and mostly white British, in that court. So there's not much evidence of it being caught in Peterborough. I always say it that way around. My main question to you is, big fat gypsy wedding, good or bad for you?
It's certainly not one for me.
It kind of feels like, well, I think the franchise hasn't been renewed, so it feels like it's slightly in the past. But I've just written a piece on cyber harassment, actually, and cyber stalking. And one of the things that keeps on coming up is there's the kind of online kind of comments that people get. I mean, most of it was actually about women, but I also looked at gypsies and travellers and disabled people. And you know, Katie Hopkins did a little bit of stirring last week, and she decided to talk about feral travellers, spelt badly, after her campaign on punctuation, and talk about the fact that travellers don't pay tax and they don't pay to live on sites. And you can see a lot of tropes just being endlessly repeated about gypsies and travellers, which you saw in Big Fat Gypsy Wedding as well, which is, you know, almost they invented a trope, actually, because if you talk to, say, people from the Catholic community, Irish travellers, from when they got confirmed back, say, 30 years ago, they would wear, you know, your normal white dress and brown Start-Right Clark shoes. So this is a relatively new tradition anyway, and it kind of got almost, it was, you know, there was one dressmaker in Liverpool, as far as I understand it, Thelma, but it almost got invented and it's become a trope of its own making through the TV programme. So, you know, it's something that TV has almost created its own reality, which I find slightly odd. And, you know, I think there's a kind of good rule of thumb, comes from the disability movement, but I've heard Adrian Marsh, who's Romany Gypsy, talk about it, which is nothing about us without us, and which is that you don't talk about people if you don't involve them. I don't think there's a single gypsy traveller involved in that as script writers, producer, researcher. And I think if you're going to make those programmes, you involve people. And there's a whole slew of new programmes now coming through where people are involved. I kind of think that's a better model, you know.
Did you actually see it then?
Yes.
What do you think?
Perhaps I could light on one individual point rather than making sweeping statements. But as soon as I heard the narration of the programme state that it was about to tell us what it was really like to be a traveller woman, I realised that I could not trust this programme, because that's an astonishing statement to make, if only philosophically, that you're able to fully represent the internal life of millions of people around the world, which I think they sort of roundly failed to do. And I can only imagine, I mean, I never spoke to my mother about this, but she's a Romany Gypsy, an artist and a staunch feminist. And the idea that those programmes represented her inner life is fatuous.
I'm going to have one other crack at it, though. Isn't it a little bit like a Welshman like me watching Gavin and Stacey? At one level, you know, I don't connect with any of them, but at one level I connect with all of them. And I can see what people are getting at. And it's kind of funny if you take a step back. Or is that, you know?
I mean, can I answer that a bit? I mean, I think Gavin and Stacey its influence is moderated by the fact that I think culturally in general we're aware of the contribution of Dylan Thomas, of R.S. Thomas, of people who've made an incalculable contribution to the cultural life of the nations. And perhaps that counterweight isn't quite there yet in our case. So if in order to balance that out, you had something programming-wise, which is on the increase, to be fair. I think there's actually quite a renaissance at the moment of interest in the gypsy and traveller arts to follow the flourishing of that interest in the early 60s. I'm thinking of things like the radio ballads produced by Charles Parker and Ewan McColl and Peggy Seeger. John Mills' fantastic film, Sky Western Crooked. Cultural productions where Romany and traveller culture was very subtly and accurately handled. If we had a bit more like that to balance it out, then I'd accept what you're saying. But I think in the absence of a counterweight, I think programs like that are quite dangerous.
Right, who's next? In the back there, in the middle. Fantastic.
Hiya. So you were talking earlier about use of the word gypsy and whether, and I guess how it depends on how it's used. It just made me think of the other day I was in the pub and I was sitting with some friends and we were smoking and a guy came up to us and said, "I'm really sorry to be such a gypsy, but can I have a cigarette?" And we were quite shocked and I said, "Well, you can have one if you don't use gypsy in a derogatory way." And he was quite shocked that I'd said that and was like, "Oh, it wasn't derogatory." And I was like, "Well, the way which you used it was." And then we went on to have a conversation about it and he started trying to defend himself and saying, "Well, you know, where I live, you know, there's some gypsies that live on a field near us and they steal from the town and blah, blah, blah." And we were trying to argue with him, but, you know, we don't obviously know that much. I mean, I think we did a relatively good job, but I'm wondering what you would have said to this guy.
I think it sounds like you did a pretty good job, to be honest.
Great chat-up line.
Yeah, I probably would have argued along similar lines. I mean, to be fair, I mean, you're lucky if you hear the word gypsy used in an offensive way like that, because there's a plethora of far more offensive and linguistically creative terms that I got used to hearing in the pubs when I was younger. But I mean, absolutely, it's on a par with saying that somebody's due you out of money. I don't think that kind of language has any place in civil discussion, really.
Up there? Is there someone? Yeah. Oh, I thought someone had their hand. Anyone with a question? Oh, sorry, there. Thought that'd been...
A question about the academic study, in the small study. Do you think that both the settled and travelling gypsy Roma community would have an interest in actually becoming actively involved in a major study or a group of major studies? And if they would, is there anybody in the UK or in Europe who would have the academic nous and clout to carry out such studies and actually come up with some real data? Because even yourselves, who obviously have some significant knowledge, don't have real numbers.
Are you talking about on domestic violence?
I'm talking about anything. I mean, from what I gather from what you're saying, there's a real need to gather more data about the community so that we, non-community members, have a better and more rationally based understanding.
I'm just wondering if I can step in, if data gathering research is the best way for us to be kind of better understood by people. I probably question that. I don't know if my understanding of, for instance, French culture is based on any statistics that I have in mind with regard, and I'm not denigrating the fact that there may well be scope to do further studies. Actually, there's a fantastic amount of research that does go on already, much of it sort of EU funded, with regard to Romany poverty, for instance, or and other statistics. It's a question of interpretation as much, really. I wasn't trying to call into question that studies that have been done have a factual sort of basis. It's more a question of utility, I think. I think it's, at the moment, at least equally important for there to be more gypsy and traveller voices out there, people that you can actually relate to, rather than the numbers as such.
What about doing that literally, having a Roma individual or band on Britain's Got Talent? That kind of thing, just in mainstream popular culture, just some sort of role model that somebody identifies with, is endeared towards. and I don't mean it to sound facetious, but isn't that the ultimate aim, that it seems like a normal part of life, and there are role models, and there are people out there who represent very different images and perceptions for people? Or is that a horrific thought of...
I mean, in some ways it's starting to happen, isn't it? I think over the next 2 to 3 years you'll see a lot. I mean, there's already stuff in production, you know, right through the arts, there's a real renaissance. And as Damian says, it would be a mistake to say it's the first time it's ever happened, because there was this flowering of gypsy and traveller culture in the 1960s in the UK. And I think what's interesting is you're now getting people, newly arrived Roma, also kind of adding to it. So it will be new, it will be slightly different, because there are people coming through with different musical skills, for instance. But there's, you know, great actors, directors, playwrights, writers. So there's definitely kind of something very interesting going on in the arts. There's the church, which we've talked about outside here, the evangelical church, which is spreading rapidly through, you know, both the Romanian traveller communities in the UK and the newly arrived Roma. Now that is both good and bad. You can decide whether you're religious or not, but it has definitely, probably for many people inside themselves, removed what they see as a kind of stigma, I think, in themselves as to, you know, defining themselves as a gypsy. And that would go back to your data point. The one key thing is the census clearly underestimates how many people there are in the community, and I think that does matter, because I think then people from government underestimate it as a block vote. And I think if you underestimate people's power, then you can write them off as a community. And I think, but you can understand why a community that has been marginalised and excluded as much as this community has, and has had so many problems with the police for centuries. I mean, if you look at some of the stories in No Place to Call Home, you know, you will hear about magistrates setting up, say, gypsies who arrive, or likely lads setting up gypsies who arrive to take the fall for local crimes, for instance. That has always happened. So you can see why gypsies and travellers do not want to identify themselves to the authorities. Now, that's slightly changing now, but that's going to take time.
On that religious point, because you mentioned it, that the evangelical church is growing, but there's also a very strong tradition of Catholicism among many of the communities. I think most of us would think of the community as spiritual, but how religious, in that more conventional religious kind of sense, are the Roma?
My experience growing up was that most English gypsies were, like most of the people around them, sort of nominally Church of England, with some other cultural beliefs thrown in, some straightforward superstitions, to be honest. Although I can't help sort of repeating them. When I see a Dalmatian, I spit my hands and do this weird gesture, because when we saw a spotted dog, we thought it was good luck. So, you know, we're as susceptible to that kind of rubbish as everybody else, I think.
Is that why you read theology, just to sort it all out?
But I sort of feel like, I mean, I'm changing tack here a bit, but I feel like there's a bit of an elephant in the room that we haven't really covered, perhaps to everybody's satisfaction, and that is the fact that we do have problems as a community, as groups of people, and some of those are, I mean, there was a massive sort of hoo-ha in the news earlier in the year about gypsies and travellers being overrepresented in the prison system, which people might have read about, but we haven't really spoken about it tonight. But I mean, I felt a bit depressed by that. I wasn't, in some ways, not entirely surprised by that. But what interests me is what's behind that. And when you look at the history of the relationship between gypsies and travellers and law enforcement in this country, I mean, while I was researching my family history, I found people doing sort of unbelievably long sentences, you know, a month's hard labour for using abusive language was quite a common offence, you know, women being taken away from their infant children for swearing and things like that. And I think there's that kind of, I mean, it's not an excuse, it's just, it's interesting, isn't it, this history of antagonism, and there must be a future in which that's not the case anymore. I certainly hope there is.
In that fevered atmosphere, though, there's a case you chronicle of a charming man called Michael Joyce,
Oh, yeah.
who tracked down his ex-wife, who'd married somebody else, found him, and we'd gone past the watershed, but he basically beat him with another man, made him drink his own blood, and left his heart on the top of the television. Now, that was a particularly horrific crime, which captures the imagination and unfortunately would stay with a lot of people. That was unique in a way, but again, these things create mythologies, don't they, and legends.
But the question I'm forced to ask is if people think that crime was committed because the perpetrator was a traveller. I can't answer yes to that, I'm sorry, any more than I believe that Josef Fritzl was representative of the Austrian public.
Would you? Yeah.
I don't, but I mean, you know, in one way, it's good to hear applause in response to that, but it's such a serious issue because I think the mud sticks, to be honest, in an altogether different way when it comes to our communities. I think because it would be seen as confirming some ancient, some almost primordial sort of medieval fear. I don't know, it upsets me really.
Yeah.
There's another case, fascinating, more complex perhaps in its ethics, but of a child taken off a Roma family and given to a gay couple to be brought up. And the Roma family, who are old Irish community, I think, and deeply Catholic, are finding this particularly offensive, above and beyond losing their own child. There's a whole raft of difficult issues in that kind of example, isn't there?
I don't know that particular example, but if you look at Roma and traveller and gypsy children, they're overrepresented in the care system, and actually they're not. There's a really good move actually, which is to make sure that they're adopted or fostered by their own community. I was adopted myself out of my community, and I think it's clear that if you deracinate people, it confuses them. And you know, some of the stories from traveller children who were fostered by people from who didn't understand about traveller traditions or culture were quite heartbreaking actually. And I can understand why that family, I can't comment on that particular family because I don't know anything about that particular story, but you can understand why any family, particularly say if you have grandparents who might, kinship care, you know, is obviously what you would try to go to in any situation rather than adopt out of a family, because you know, you want to try and keep that family in the traditions if possible, and it's heartbreaking. You know, the sad thing about all the stories about gypsy stealing is in fact they're the inverse of what is happening in Britain. It's not that the authorities are stealing children, but they are taking away a lot of children out of proportion from gypsy traveller and Roma communities, rather than gypsies stealing children, which is obviously the big, there was the furore with Blonde Maria earlier this year.
Well, I better clear that one up pretty quickly. Professor Thomas Acton, who's an expert on Romany history and culture, can confirm for you that there's not a single documented case in world history of a gypsy or traveller family stealing a non-gypsy child. There are, however, thousands of documented cases of authorities taking away gypsy and traveller children in order to cure them of their culture. Yeah. There are also 2 cases in Ireland last year of the Irish authorities removing blonde-haired children from Romany families because they didn't think it was possible they were Romany because of their hair colour. That's absurd as the medieval suggestion that we're child stealers.
We've got about 10 minutes left. Gentleman in the back, lady in the front, and then gentleman in the back. Fantastic.
Some of the most racist comments about the gypsies that I've heard have come from Romanians in this country. And it was quite shocking to me. Yeah. It made me realize that, part of the problem there, of course, is they're on the defensive because they feel the racism towards them with the whole EU debate and migration and so on. But it was clear to me that there are some serious issues of racism in other European countries. This is clearly a shared problem across the European Union. And I'm wondering whether you could give us some insights of whether there are any examples within Europe of the community having been integrated better than here, and whether there's there's anywhere we can learn from, any kind of best practice that you could share.
Certainly true. I've encountered a lot of minicab drivers who are Romanian who say the Roma give us a bad reputation. We're hardworking, they're lazy and all that. It's a sort of terrible problem to sort of have to counter.
I can understand the frustration at that sense of misrepresentation. I mean, I mentioned earlier that there's a similarity in the ethnic names. The word Romani, as in Romani gypsy, actually comes from an ancient Indian word, Rom, which means a person in sort of Sanskrit. The word Romanian, or Romanește in Romanian, as many of you probably know, is the same derivation as Roman, as in the Roman Empire. So there are these two separate etymologies which have led to what we call faux amis, or words that sound the same, but actually have different origins. On the other hand, while respecting that frustration, I can't help but sort of have a slightly wry smile at the historical reality behind it, which is that Romanian wealth, the wealth of Romania as a nation, or as the three principalities that it was prior to its unification, was built on 400 years of enslavement of Romani people. It's an absolute analogue to the situation of black people in the American South. The only difference being that it went on for longer, from the last years of the 14th century up until Victorian times. That's the kind of time scale we're looking at. And tribes like the Beash, for instance, a Romanian Romani subgroup, no longer speak the Romani language, because if they did, they were punished with kongs, which are, I don't know if anyone's familiar with a kong, but it's an iron device that goes around your neck, fitted with spikes, so that you can't go near anybody, but it also pushes inwards if you try and escape. Your tongue would be removed if you spoke the Romani language. So this is the kind of background to Thomas Acton, the expert I mentioned, to his statement that the crimes committed against Romani people are of such intensity, longevity, and brutality that to focus on, howbeit, the very real crimes that some Romani people do commit, more than those, could be seen to evidence a slightly twisted worldview, I think.
Okay. Somebody over here, there.
Looking forward, if you had three wishes to improve the long-term lot of the gypsy community, what would they be?
You go first, Damon.
3 wishes.
Well, I don't know how much benefit this is to everybody, really, but I'd like to see the Romani language recognised as a minority language of the United Kingdom. It is one. Linguists have never disputed that. If you buy a book about the languages of the UK by someone like Glanville Price, say, a respected authority on the subject, you'll see alongside Welsh, Manx, Cornish, Ulster Scots, the old ones like Anglo-Norman, you'll see Romani in there, but it's not there in the official documentation. So I'd like to see that change. And I think that could have a serious impact in terms of people seeing us not as perpetual aliens, but as part of the cultural landscape. But that's really small fry in comparison to the medieval conditions people are living in across swathes of Europe, and basic education, an improvement in health, and enfranchisement in those areas are far more pressing than me getting my linguistic kicks, I think.
That was 4, I think. Right, lady in the middle.
You just touched a little bit on education there. I mean, I grew up on market stalls and stuff in Blackpool, so I grew up around a lot of Irish travellers, very hard-working, wonderful people. I was left with them as a child because I'd be safe with them. So we have no, prejudice in our family regarding that. However, when we saw some episodes, we didn't watch it a lot, of Big Gypsy Wedding and all that, almost all of the girls were illiterate. And this is why the Lady Thelma was teaching them dressmaking, because she wanted them to have a trade. And the girls weren't allowed to go to school, they weren't allowed to have a trade, they weren't allowed to do anything, and it was a big fight for Thelma to get them to be allowed to do dressmaking. Can you give us some sort of input on that?
I mean, my question would be again was that a construction of reality or was it reality? You know, because there's reality TV and then there's reality. Because in my, 2006, 8 years of visiting Gypsy and Traveller families and now newly arrived Roma more recently, I haven't seen a single family where a girl has been prevented from getting an education, personally. So that would be my question is, did that actually happen or was it constructed?
You do talk about a lot of families who choose to do homeschooling.
I mean,
and I'm fairly
yeah.
well educated, but if my kids were educated by me, they would be less well educated than they are.
I'd be less well educated if I was homeschooling my children as well, personally. I mean, I think there's some homeschooling because of bullying at school, but actually there's a lot of teachers now, and that's started to change because of cuts, who are actually very, very committed to educating Gypsy and Traveller children. I think there is there's still some perception that some girls maybe go into trades like hairdressing and beauticians, but that is changing very fast, I think. I think that those aspirations, are changing extremely fast, and in a way, maybe Big Fat Gypsy Wedding is already reflecting a reality that, if ever it was true in the past already. I don't know, that's my feeling. I don't know what Damian has to say about it.
There may well be families where girls find it trickier to get an education, whether that's because of the local school situation or because their family have a certain attitude to it. My mother did a master's degree in textile design in the 1980s, so quite a while ago, and that wasn't seen as particularly weird. So I think it probably depends on the family as much as on the culture. But what I won't do is take the word on this issue of somebody who referred to young teenage girls as looking like prostitutes and believed that Irish travellers and Romani people spoke the same language, and yet was given effectively the role of an anthropological commentator on a major TV series, which is ridiculous.
Any more? We can sneak in one last one. I see a hand here, I think. You're silhouetted, but I swear there's a hand in the air there. And that will probably be our last one. Thank you very much for...
This evening's conversation is focused very much on us looking inward to the communities, and I'd be very interested in both our panellists giving us a view of what they think of us.
Well, it's an easy question for me to answer, and that's that I don't know most of you, so I can't answer it. But part of the work, most of the work that we do at the Rural Media Company when it comes to my community is actually trying to just diversify the voice. If you go on travellerstimes.org.uk, you can hear a lot of voices from different people in the community, some of whom, to be fair, have some pretty unreconstructed views of non-travellers, as many non-travellers do of them, and it's quite interesting to see that. And for the most part, people are very empathetic and are sort of happy, perhaps almost boringly well-adjusted. But I like that. And rather than efforts to increase the number of role models, which is a term I don't particularly relish hearing, to be honest, it is more about just increasing the variety of voices, isn't it? And getting more of the human life that's there, out there.
I mean, I think there is a change. I think people want to hear now from the communities. I'm not from the community. I'm a kind of slightly hybrid mixture from not completely from England. But what I see is that despite Nigel Farage's best attempts, there are lots of people who do understand that there are things to be gained from communities that aren't wholly Anglo-Saxon, and for me that's a really good thing.
And maybe that's a note to end on, because you go back 2 stages on one side of my kids' family and the blood is foreign. Same with you, but in your case, Damian, you can go back centuries.
Yeah.
In the UK.
Nigel Farage would be prouder of you than family, not others. One last point, there's a Gypsy Roma Traveller Police Association now, whose members will soon be entering triple figures of serving police officers who are from the Gypsy and Traveller communities. If that's not food for thought, based on everything we've spoken about, I don't know what is.